Someone new has stepped onto the trail, and the forest is already whispering their name. You re-listening to ASMR 404 Found. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. They said Elkwood Pass used to be a rail line back in the 1800s, winding between pine-covered ridges and jagged shale cliffs before the Great Slide of '87 buried half the tracks in rock and took 3 cars and 22 passengers down. With it, no survivors, no bodies, just a twisted collection of brass rails and broken wheels left to rust somewhere under the soil and shale, and everyone moved on except the stories that clung to the trailhead like moss clings to a northern rock. Fasai never believed the legends, but it was late September, and I needed the solitude badly. And when I passed through Pagosa Springs with its warm sulfur air and sleepy mountain gas stations, I saw the faded sign for the trail peeking out behind. A curtain of aspens, the wood warped from years of sun and snow, and spray-painted with the word "Sorry" in black, dripping letters, but still legible underneath it all. Elkwood Pass, Trailhead, San Juan National Forest. Maintenance halted 2003 travel. At your own risky, parked my old Tacoma just off the shoulder near the trail gate. A bent metal post still chained shut, even though the rest of the fencing had long since collapsed into the grass, and the place was quieter than I expected, not just in the usual backcountry kind of way, but quieter than it should have been. Even the birds seemed like they were holding their breath, and I know that sounds dramatic, but I swear the stillness in the air had a weight like the silence that comes after you knock something over and know someone heard. E.T. should have turned back, but I'd already left a voicemail for my brother telling him I'd be off-grid for a few days, and that I'd be camping out west of Pagosa Springs in the San Juan. But I didn't give him the exact spot because I figured it didn't matter. This wasn't a dangerous hike. It was a forgotten trail, and I just needed space to think and clear my head. Trail started gentle with tall yellow grass lining each side and crickets ticking beneath the stalks like an old watch being wound too tightly, and the pines leaned in from the sides, swaying only slightly like they were curious about me. And I hiked for hours without seeing another soul, just crunching gravel and the occasional low rustle of something in the underbrush, always behind me, never ahead of us. I got deeper in the trees, started to change, more twisted, darker bark stripped in places, like something clawed it, and the undergrowth became thick with thorny vines I couldn't identify. I had to step carefully, and more than once I found old wooden railroad ties peeking out from the dirt, split and gray like broken ribs. Some were embedded so deep it was like the mountain had started to digest them, and the deeper I went, the more I noticed this smell, not rot exactly, but something damp and metallic like rain on rusted iron, or the scent of blood that had time to dry in the heat. The time I made camp, it was nearly sunset, and I found a small clearing near what looked like an old utility shed slumped against the hillside. The roof partially caved in, and the door hanging off one hinge. The place was empty inside, except for a rusted shovel and a pile of rotted canvas sacks. Something told me not to touch them, and I didn't. clearing was unnaturally quiet all through the evening, even as I boiled water for my freeze-dried stew and rolled out my sleeping bag. I realized I hadn't seen a single deer or squirrel or even an insect since passing that stretch of sunken railroad tracks, and the wind had stopped completely, so the air felt heavy and motionless while night fell. It fell fast and hard, like a curtain being yanked down, and the darkness here wasn't the usual kind with stars and shadows. It was thick, almost granular, like you could scoop it up in your hands and squeeze. And I tried to focus on the crackle of my little fire and the warmth of my flask, but the silence around me was the kind that made your ears ring. I must have drifted off at some point, because I woke to the sound of metal scraping against stone, distant at first, then closer, like someone dragging something heavy across the rocks. And my fire had burned down to embers, the air cold, and the trees around me black and still, and I held my breath, listening, because the sound wasn't steady. It stopped and started, and there was something else underneath it, something like whispers, but not in a language I knew, more like a rhythm, or breath pattern, soft and looping. And close I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line, and I swear I saw movement to the left, a pale flicker of something thin darting between the trees, too quick to follow, and when I stood, the ground felt wrong, like it had a slight pulse under my boots, and I told myself it was just the altitude, maybe low blood sugar, maybe my imagination, but I didn't go back to sleep, not really. I just sat there waiting for dawn, watching the woods like they were watching me. Back in the morning, I found the shovel from the shed was missing, and there were drag marks in the dirt, leading away from the clearing, parallel to the old rail bed, and something inside me twisted, but I forced myself to pack up and keep moving deeper along the trail, because I didn't want to admit I was scared. Not yet, not this early into the trip. And besides, it was probably just a prank or a bear or some explanation I could accept in the daylight. But the daylight didn't help. Not really, because as I hiked, the trail began to shift subtly in ways that didn't make sense. The grade would slope one way, but my legs told me I was walking the opposite direction, or I'd pass the same dead pine 3 times in 20 minutes, even though I'd been walking in a straight line, and at one point I looked back and there were 2 sets of prints in the dirt mine, and another larger set alongside them, spaced too far apart for a normal stride, too wide, too deep, and I checked over my shoulder constantly, but saw no Annie. Eventually, I reached a section where the rail tracks were mostly intact, half sunken, but still traceable through the undergrowth, and I followed them as the trail narrowed into a kind of gully with high, shale walls on both sides. The air colder here, and the wind louder, like it was funneled through the stone. And somewhere along this stretch, I noticed something strange in the rock faces, carvings maybe, or wear patterns. I couldn't tell, but they looked deliberate spirals and slashes and tall stick figures, etched high enough that someone would have needed a ladder or been unnaturally callous. I traced one with my hand. The stone felt warm despite the cold, and my fingertips came away smeared with something dark, reddish-brown and sticky, and I staggered back and almost slipped on the gravel, but caught myself just in time, and as I turned to leave I heard something breathing behind me, not loud but wet and rhythmic, like an animal with fluid in its lungs, and I ran. I didn't even think. I just ran back the way I came, only it wasn't the same way, because nothing looked familiar anymore. The trees had shifted, the slope reversed, and every marker I'd left was gone. No cairn, no ribbon, no broken branches. It was like the trail was rearranging itself in real time, and I ran until my legs gave out and I collapsed near a ravine I didn't remember crossing before, with a shallow stream at the bottom and bones scattered along the bank, clean white and sun-bleached, and shaped too much like human femurs and ribs and jawbones. And I wanted to scream, but no sound came out, just steam on the cold rye. Stayed by that stream until nightfall, trying to decide whether to follow it or climb out and keep looking for the trail. But neither option felt safe, and I could feel something watching from the ridges above, from the twisted pines, from the shadows between rocks. And when darkness came again, it came too fast, and with it the whispers returned, louder, more distinct and layered, like overlapping voices speaking in tongues. And I knew then that I was not supposed to be here, that I had crossed into some place that Elkwood Pass was meant to heighten when the moon rose. It was red like a clot in the sky, and I saw the silhouettes of tall, thin figures standing along the ridge, unmoving, unblinking, too long-limbed to be human. And I knew I would not survive another night if I stayed by that stream. I forced myself to climb away from the ravine, even though my legs felt like wet rope and my brain kept looping the image of those tall shapes lining the ridge above, because every part of my instinct screamed that they were still watching, even if I couldn't see their eyes. And the whispers followed me up the slope, quieter now, not in volume but in intensity, more deliberate, like a voice whispering into your ear, not from a distance but close enough that you could feel it tickle your skin. The forest had changed again in a way that felt so wrong my eyes couldn't process it. The trees were too evenly spaced, too symmetrical, their limbs forming unnatural arches over the trail, like a cathedral built by things that had never seen one. And under my boots the dirt felt soft, not like soil but like fabric stretched over something rotten and giving. And when I bent down and brushed it away, I found more tracks, but not prints, exactly more like indentations, shapes I didn't recognize, bulbils with ridged centers and claw-like marks that sank too deep to be left by any living animal. Walked for hours, I think, or maybe less. The sun barely moved in the sky, as if time itself had slowed, and the wind was gone again. Not a single leaf rustled. The silence was absolute, except for my own breath and the steady ticking noise coming from deeper in the woods, like the sound of a grandfather clock echoing without walls. And I realized it was matching the rhythm of my heart until I stopped. And it didn't. Kept going on. Its own me turned off the trail, not because I wanted to, but because something pulled me to, and my legs obeyed, like they weren't entirely mine anymore, like I was being walked. And the deeper I went, the colder it got, not just chilly, but the kind of cold that burns like dry ice, touching flesh and every tree I passed had scratches, deep gouges, as if something massive had scraped its claws through the bark, not in anger but in passing, like marking territory. came to a clearing shaped like a circle, too perfect to even the ground, sunken in the middle, like something heavy had once rested. There, and surrounding it, were old wooden crosses, rotted and splintered, some overturned, some leaning, all of them, carved with dates and initials except the dates. Didn't make sense. Some were in the 1800s, but others were from the future, 2060, 7/2091, and one that simply said, Uneverin. The center was a stump, and on that stump rested the missing shovel from the shed, except the metal was now blackened and bent, and its wooden handle soaked with something dark, and I could hear the whispers again right at the edge of the clearing, but I couldn't see anything, not until I stepped closer, and then I saw the ground move. It pulsed, not visibly, but I could feel it in my bones, like a heartbeat thudding under the soil, and I stepped back fast, and my heel struck something hard, and when I turned, there was a door in the ground, a rusted metal hatch, half buried under moss and stone, and carved with symbols I'd seen earlier in the cliffs, spirals and stickmen and runes that hurt to look at, like my eyes were rejecting the shapes. Themselves shouldn't have opened it, but I had. Tough hatch groaned like it hadn't been moved in decades, and beneath it was a stairwell descending into blackness, cut from stone, slick and narrow and steep, and the smell from below was sharp and acidic, like mold and ash and rust, and I went down because I wasn't in control anymore, because whatever this trail was, whatever Elkwood Pass had become, it didn't want me to live. The stairs seemed endless, the light from above disappearing far too fast, and I used my flashlight to scan the walls, which were lined with old railroad spikes, driven directly into the rock, some bent, some broken, but all placed like markers or warnings, and the deeper I went, the louder the ticking became, until it wasn't ticking anymore, but grinding. The sound of gears turning, and iron dragging, and underneath it all the whispers rose again, not layered this time, but unified into one voice, deep and guttural and wet, like it came from a mouth that had never spoken. The fourth tunnel opened into a chamber wide and circular and covered in soot, the floor littered with bones, too many to count, too many to ignore, and in the center was a machine I can't describe, not really. It was all wrong, shaped like a locomotive, but twisted in design. No wheels, no chimney, just a mass of black iron pipes and valves and levers that pulsed like veins, and it was warm like skin, and I swear it breathed hanging from the ceiling where the bodies I didn't count them. I couldn't. Their faces were gone, or stretched or melted, and some were still moving, twitching gently like puppets suspended by strings, but there were no strings, just black vines wrapped around their limbs, pulsing with the same rhythm as the machine, and I knew I had to get out, but I couldn't move, not because of fear, but because something behind me was breathing again, and this time it was so close I could feel it on my neck. I turned and saw it not fully, not with my eyes, but in the part of my brain that understands nightmares. Before you wake, it was tall and thin, and its skin was tight over bones that weren't quite human, and its eyes were hollow and wide and filled with red. Not light, but liquid, like they were bleeding inward, and it opened its mouth, but the sound that came out was not sound, it was memory. felt it claw through my mind, pulling up thoughts I hadn't touched in years. The time I let my dog die alone, the fight with my mother just before her stroke, the lie I told my brother, the feeling of being 5 and lost in a department store, watching strangers pass by without noticing me, every shame, every fear, every wound, it pulled them out and showed them to me like trophies, and it laughed. Not with a mouth, but with my own voice thrown back at me, warped and hollow-eyed. Ronnie, don't know how I got out. I don't remember climbing the stairs. I don't remember daylight, but I woke somewhere further up the trail, blood on my hands and something moving under my skin like a twitch or a burrowing thing. And my pack was gone, and my map was gone, and the compass spun in place, like it couldn't decide what was really. Tried retracing my steps, but the trail wouldn't let me. Every turn led back to the same place, the clearing with the stump, the circle of crosses, the open hatch still gaping and breathing, and every time I passed it, I felt something behind me step closer, and my limbs grew colder, and my skin felt thinner, and I started to see things in the corners of my eyes, pale hands reaching from between trees, eyes peeking through knots in the bark teeth, where mouths shouldn't been. The voices became clearer, not whispers anymore, but words. Zig Fedratoni. The third night I knew I wouldn't survive much longer. My food was gone, and the forest wouldn't let me sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the machine that shouldn't exist, and the bodies twitching, and the face of the thing with my memories in its mouth. And I knew it had marked May found a journal that wasn't mine, tucked into a rotted stump, pages damp and smudged with age, and something darker, and I flipped through it and saw sketches of the same symbols I'd seen all over the cliffs and the machine and under the hatch, and in the back was a note that read if you're reading this, it's too late. The journal burned in my hands, as if each word etched into the pages had a temperature, and by the time I reached the final sentence, something behind me was whispering it aloud, not mimicking it, not reciting it, but remembering it, as if I was not the first to hold those pages, and would not be the last. And when I looked up, the trees had moved again, not swayed, not bent. They had physically shifted. Their trunks were closer, their branches lower, and every step I took sounded louder than it should, like I was being heard, like the forest was recording every motion in some archive beneath. The dirt. I walked north, I think, or west. The compass was dead, but the slope felt like it climbed slightly, and I needed higher ground if I wanted a chance at finding signal or escape. But the moment I stepped into the new clearing, something changed in my chest. My ribs ached like they were tightening inward, not from cold, not from fear, but from pressure, like my lungs were no longer allowed to expand all the way. And the ground in that clearing was wrong, too flat, too smooth, too perfect. And when I knelt down and brushed it with my hand, I realized the soil wasn't soil at all, but ash. I stood and saw that the trees around me were burnt, but not charred, not scorched. They were peeled, blackened from the inside, as if something had hollowed them out and stood them back up and nailed their roots into the earth for show. And the air was heavier now, not just with moisture or weight, but with presence. The feeling of a door opened behind you, even though you're alone, and I heard something call my name, not shout. Not scream, just speak it calmly from the tree line. And I turned, and there was nothing there, but I answered it anyway. It didn't feel optional. My voice came out strange, as if it didn't belong to me, slightly deeper, slightly slower. And when I heard it echo back through the woods, I realized it wasn't echoing, it was responding, and it said my name again, and this time it came from the other side of the clearing. And I turned again, and I saw the first body standing, not moving, not twitching, just standing 20 feet from me, facing the opposite direction. Pale skin pulled tight over frame, too long to be human. Wearing my shirt, my boots, my face, and it turned slowly, and its mouth opened wider than should be possible, and it whispered, "You came back to lay time." Ran again, because that's all I knew how to do at that point, and the trees grabbed at me, branches snapping against my arms, thorns tearing across my legs, and I stumbled into another hollow, this one ringed by old rail ties, still sunken into the soil and forming a perfect circle, and at its center was a wooden door lying flat and breathing. I knew what I was supposed to do, and I knew what it wanted, and I knew I had already failed because I had stepped onto the circle without realizing it, and now I couldn't leave, and something behind the door was knocking, not loudly, not rhythmically, but persistently, like a child pressing fingers against glass and waiting for it to crack, and the air around me shimmered like heat rising off asphalt, but there was no heat, just vibration, the low hum of something waking up, and the trees whispered. Again, louder, now layered and fast, and in English this time, in the voices of people I knew and didn't. Noddy digdigand. Ideally used my hands because the shovel was gone, or maybe I had never taken it, and the ash under my nails bled and the soil. Paws thick with hair and teeth and old nails, and I dug until I hit something hard and metal and breathing, and it opened on its own. I don't remember climbing down. I just remember being in the tunnel again, but it was different this time, longer, darker, slick with fluid that pulsed like veins, and every surface was warm and flexing, like lungs expanding in slow, syncopated rhythm with something I couldn't see, and the machine was Gonya. Maybe it had never been a machine. Maybe it had always been alive and waiting. And when I reached the center chamber, it was no longer empty. They were all there, lined up along the walls, not moving, not speaking, just standing still and breathing and facing the center where the engine had once been, now replaced by something older, something made of bone and stone and flesh and metal. Something with dozens of arms and none of them moving, and one eye in the center that opened when I entered and blinked. And in that moment, I remembered everything I was supposed to forget. Trail was never a trail. It was a wound, a scar in the earth marking the place where something tried to come through centuries ago. And the train tracks were an attempt to seal it, a mistake dressed as progress, and the slide in 87 wasn't natural, and the people who vanished weren't lost. They were taken, they were chosen, and now I was chosen too. I didn't look at me, it looked through me. It showed me the night I was born, and the night I would die. and the thin line between where the trail curved and where it didn't, and I felt my bones shift slightly, just slightly, not enough to scream. Just enough to feel the wrongness crawling through my marrow like worms, and the whispers stopped. And the silence came back, and I realized it wasn't silence at all, it was listening. I woke somewhere near the edge of the forest, near the trailhead gate. The chain snapped, the sign gone, and the Tacoma covered in pine needles and scratch marks across the hood. I was alone again. Or maybe I never wasn't, and my phone was dead. But someone had carved a symbol into the screen, and I didn't dare turn it. Only drove until I ran out of gas in Alamosa, and I walked the rest of the way to the sheriff's station, and I told them everything I remembered, and they smiled and nodded and took my statement and asked me to wait, and I watched through the one-way glass as they called someone, not dispatch, not state police, someone higher, and I saw the badge on his lapel spiral. Never made it, Hamime. Writing this from a cabin they've given me somewhere in northern Colorado. Or maybe it isn't Colorado. Maybe it's just a place shaped like it, and I'm watched day and night, not by people, not always, and I'm allowed to go outside. Sometimes, but never too far, and never into the woods. And I can still hear it breathing beneath the floor last night. I saw a light through the tresa, single headlamp swaying left to right, the way mine used. To Dosomion, new has stepped onto the trailland. I heard the forest sound. They warned me about Juniper Gulch, the way locals always warn about places they pretend don't matter, with nervous laughs and too long pauses, like they're trying not to remember too much. They say the wind sings in that canyon, and the rocks hum, and sometimes when the sun sets wrong, the air tastes like copper, and you can hear voices even when you're alone. I didn't care about stories. I needed space away from phones and people and all the buzzing noise of life. So I loaded my gear into the Jeep and drove toward Gila National Forest with a topo map, a broken compass, and too much bottled anger from a life that had started to shrink around me like a tightening. New Seth Trailhead was almost hidden, the sign nailed into a twisted juniper trunk so old it had grown round the edges of the wood, half swallowing it, the words carved into it, barely visible beneath moss and rot. Juniper Gulch Trailhead elevation. 7,100 feet, proceed at own risk, and someone had scratched 3 words beneath it in what looked like dried clay, or maybe blood-red choir sinks path. Started wide, dusty, a soft reddish-brown, winding through gnarled trees, with bark-like flaking scales, and the deeper I went, the more the ground changed dry at first. Then soft, then damp and slightly warm, like a heartbeat was pulsing beneath the topsoil, and when I touched the trunk of one of the thicker junipers, it felt like skin at bark. Skin like something breathing slowly behind wood. I set camp near a narrow bend in the canyon, where the rock walls pressed inward like a throat tightening the air, already thinner than I expected. The stars above, too, sharp like shards of glass hanging from a black ceiling. And when I lay down, I noticed there was no sound, not even wind. Not a single night insect, just silence, so full it rang in my ears like pressure in a diving belly. Woke sometime after midnight to the sound of humming soft, at first drifting through the canyon in a strange harmony, like dozens of voices layered in a slow, pulsing drone. And I told myself it was wind resonance, maybe rocks vibrating or air currents funneling through the gulch. But then I realized it wasn't just humming. It was a songer human song, but I couldn't understand. The words weren't in any language I knew. Voices were getting closer, and I crawled out of my tent, slowly clutching my flashlight like a weapon, and the beam caught movement near the ridgeline, tall shapes standing in perfect stillness. Their limbs impossibly thin, their heads tilted, as if listening or remembering something, and their mouths open wide but not moving, and the song still playing like a broken record, echoing from their chests. I didn't scream, I don't know why. Maybe the sound had drained out of me, or maybe something in me already knew screaming wouldn't help. Blinked and they were gone, and not walked, not faded. Just gone. I told myself it was a dream, but when I woke at dawn, there were red handprints on the rocks surrounding my camp, too high for any person to reach without climbing, and spaced too evenly, like a pattern, like a warning. As I packed up my gear, I realized something had changed about the path. The color was deeper, more crimson, and the air thicker, and each step felt heavier, not like exhaustion, but like gravity was stronger here, pulling me down slightly, as if something beneath the earth was reaching up through my boots. I passed a section of canyon where the rocks hummed when I walked by, and I mean literally hummed, a low resonant sound that made my teeth hurt. And when I touched the stone, it vibrated like it was alive, like it was speaking in a language I wasn't meant to. Herbie noon. The trail disappeared, entirely replaced by rows of tall, twisted junipers spaced perfectly apart, and their branches all bent in the same direction westward, toward a darker part of the gulch where no sunlight touched. And I swear I heard the song again, quieter, this time coming from the trees themselves. Kept walking because turning around felt impossible, like the trail behind me no longer existed. And when I checked my compass, the needle spun, then stopped, then pointed straight down. Thought night. I didn't sleep. The ground was too warm, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was crawling just beneath the skin of the world. Not bugs, not animals, but something larger, something pressing up from below, like a scream rising through dirt. At one point I saw lights in the canyon, not flashlight beams, but red glowing orbs, moving slowly in a line, weaving through the trees like lanterns carried by invisible hands. And as they passed, I swear the canyon walls breathed in and out like lungs, inflating slowly, holding, then releasing. Bite. And the rocks began to bleed, not water, not rust, blood thick, dark red, running from the seams between stone-like veins split open. And the song returned, louder, close, more voices. No, and one of them sounded like mine. I sat frozen for hours after I heard the voice that sounded like mine drifting through the canyon in that low harmony of layered humming, because it wasn't just similar, it was exact. Every breath, every cadence, every little stammer I make when cut, I'm nervous, echoed perfectly through that red glowing harmony, and it sounded like it was calling, not in words, but in shape, and rhythm, like my own breath had been weaponized and turned against me. When I finally moved, the sky above was still dark. But not from night. It was as if the color had drained out of it entirely. No stars, no moon, just a blank sheet of gray-black. Nothing pressing down like a low ceiling. And I walked without knowing why or where. And the trail that didn't exist anymore still guided me like it had teeth under the dirt, pulling at my ankles, and each tree I passed looked older, more warped their trunks, cracked with symbols too perfect to be natural circles within spirals, and mouths with no eyes, all carved deep and glistening like they were freshly cut. And every now and then the song would rise again, louder, fuller, and I would see movement behind me just at the edge of the tree's net. Running, not hiding. Just keeping pace. I passed an old mining cart, rusted and half sunk into the soil, its wheels still warm as if it had just been used. And around it the trees were dead, not fallen, not rotted, just stripped of bark and leaves, like they'd been emptied. And something inside the cart caught my eye, a rolled piece of canvas stained dark red, tied with twine. And when I opened it, I found a map, not of the trail, not of Gila, not of anywhere I recognize, but it was moving slow, shifting lines and shapes, like breathing arteries, a living landscape. And in the center, marked in red ink, was a symbol matching the ones carved into the bark around me, a spiral with 3 vertical lines cutting through it, and the words, "The choir is below." Air shifted around me like a sigh, and the song stopped completely. For the first time since I arrived, silence hurt more than the noise. I pressed on down a slope that hadn't been there before, and found a wide cavern mouth where no map showed one. The walls of it were too smooth to round, like something had melted the stone or chewed through it, and I stepped inside without thinking, because there was no choice anymore. Not really. The gulch wasn't letting me leave. Not without seeing deeper. I went, the warmer it got. Not normal heat, but thick, like blood heat. And the walls began to pulse subtly in time with something I couldn't hear, but could feel in my stomach. And at the lowest part of the cavern, I saw themth red quietly. Weren't people, not anymore. Maybe not ever. They were tall, thin figures like before, their skin stretched and stained, the color of dried blood. No eyes, no mouths, just smooth faces like masks. And they stood in a wide circle around a pit that breathed. And they didn't move, they didn't turn back. They sang with mouths, not with throats, but with their bodies. The sound rising out of them like steam from a vent, and I felt it more than I heard it. It filled me. It crawled into my ears and behind my eyes and down my throat, and I dropped to my knees from the pressure, because the sound wasn't music. It was memory, not mine, at first time. Saw flashes of other hikers' boots, torn and broken hands, reaching out from dirt, eyes wide and frozen voices screaming and fading. And then I saw myself walking into the canyon, over and over, each version slightly different, but always ending here, always on my knees, always surrounded by the choir and thenon of them. Turn it not all the way, just slightly, and where its face should have been, there was a mirror, and in it, the reflection, I saw myself, but not me. Not anymore. My face stretched and pulled, and my skin stained like theirs, and I realized I wasn't watching the choir. I was standing in eerie, don't know how. I woke back on the trail somewhere nearer, split in the canyon that I hadn't seen before, and the trail marker now read something different, WLCOM to the red quirth. Words carved into the wood with something sharp and deep and recent, the grooves still leaking a thin, dark fluid. And when I looked back, the path was gone, the cave was gone, the canyon walls behind me were solid and silent, and the air didn't move. I kept walking, trying to reach high ground for signal, but my phone wouldn't even power on the battery fried, and the screen spiderwebbed with cracks I didn't remember happening, and I could feel something beneath my feet, shifting like roots that moved or veins that twitched, and at one point I heard footsteps behind Maybew. They were my own exactly, mine same, pace same, rhythm stop it thee. Didn't he turned and saw nothing, but I felt breath on my cheek, cold and wet and slow, like someone exhaling through teeth, and I started to cry without meaning. At night I camped on a rock shelf overlooking the gulch, and the sky was wrong again. The stars spiraled inward toward black center, and every now and then a light would blink red deep in the trees below, moving slowly like a searching eye. And I heard the choir again, far away this time, but not singing. No mean dozens of voice or mine. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat on the rock shelf, knees to my chest, flashlight. Dead hands shaking, listening to my own voice echo back from the trees below. Not just once, but layered. Dozens, maybe hundreds of versions of me saying my name, over and over, like a chant, like an accusation, and the air around me never warmed, even when the sky lightened, just barely into a gray that passed for morning me. Limbs felt hollow, not tired, not weak, hollow, like something had taken pieces out of me while I wasn't looking, and replaced them with smoke and stone and vibration. And when I stood, I felt the gulch breathe through my bones. I needed out. Trail was gone. It didn't disappear. It rearranged itself. The junipers had moved, the cliffs had shifted, and when I tried to double back, my own footprints were gone, not erased, replaced with prints identical to mine, but facing the opposite direction, like I'd already returned from a place I hadn't reached yet, and the air began to hum. Again, low and constant, like a warning. I moved toward high ground, hoping for a ridgeline. Anything to break the pattern of twisted trail and pulsing dirt, but everything narrowed into stone corridors deeper into the gulch, and I realized I wasn't on a path anymore. I was inside. Something inside. Ith red choir wasn't just a group, it wasn't just a memorite, was a leviand. I was in its throat. I past walls etched with images, not drawings, carvings, scenes of people crawling out of the earth, their faces wide with silent screaming, their hands stretched toward nothing, and I saw one carving of a figure kneeling before a spiral sun, bleeding from the eyes and mouth, and the blood became roots crawling outward, wrapping around the gulch. I walked for hours or minutes. Time didn't behave normally anymore. The sun didn't move, the air didn't shift. My body ached from the inside, and my vision blurred, until the trail opened into a massive clearing, perfectly round, ringed with stones. Too uniform to be natural, and at its center, it wasn't made of wood or stone. It was made of bodies pressed together, fused into a shape like a spire of flesh and bone and hair and teeth, and at the top stood a single figure taller than the rest, thin as air, faceless, with its arms open and its chest split like a flower and inside its ribs. I saw a beating thing, pulsing red and wet and ancient. Voices rose again, not in harmony, not any more in conflict. They screamed and moaned, and cried and laughed in every version of my voice I'd ever used, and some I didn't recognize, some younger, some older, and I understood then what the choir really wasted was memorate, was guilted, was the weight of self you couldn't carry anymore. Made real, made loud, I fell to my knees again, not from fear, not from pain, but from recognition it knew meat. Had always known, May saw flashes of myself as a child, kneeling by a dead rabbit. I hadn't meant to kill my father, lying in a hospital bed. And me, too afraid to say goodbye, my first love, leaving in the rain while I said nothing. Every choice I never made, every word I never spoke, every scream. I swallowed thee, sang now through the altar, through the choir, through me, and then silence and not absence of sound, absence of meaning, and the figure at the top of the altar tilted its head slowly and raised its arms, and the pit beneath the altar opened wide, not like a mouth, like a memory, like a door to everything I was supposed to forget, and I felt myself slide forward, not walk, not crawl, just pulled by the knowing that I was already part of this, that I had already been chosen, but something stopped me, single hand reaching from the ground, just at the edge of the altar, thin and bloodless, and pointing away from the pit, not toward, escaped-ward, resistance, and I understood. Choir didn't consume. Every one-some of us were meant to walk. Auto carry it, sing it back into the world. I woke on the highway, 20 miles north of Gila, bruised, bleeding, dehydrated, with no memory of walking. There my pack was gone, my shoes torn open and carved into the asphalt beneath. Me was a spiral, burned, black thief. Took me to a hospital, and then to a state facility, and then to a place with no name, no signs, just white walls and whispered questions. And every night I hear the song again, faint, under the floor, under the beds, under my skin, doctors call it trauma-induced auditory recall. Call it the first verse. The red choir never stops it, just waits, and sometimes late at night when the walls feel thin and the lights flicker, I look at my reflection and I see the shape of the altar in my own eye sand. I know someone else will follow the trail soon, and when they doth you'll hear me singing.